A good sunny Sunday afternoon to all of you, or whatever time you're listening this at, seeing as there are currently zero concurrent viewers, as usual. Today we'll be continuing reading Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. In last episode, we were heading to the native reserve, and we will now see what adventures we'll be experiencing there. Alright, chapter 7. The mesa was like a ship becalmed in a strait of lion colored dust. The channel wound between precipitous banks, and slanting from one wall to the other across the valley ran a streak of green, the river and its fields. On the prow of that stone ship in the center of the strait, and seemingly a part of it, a shaped and geometrical outcrop of the naked rock, stood the pueblo of Malface, block above block, each story smaller than the one below. The tall houses rose like stepped and amputated pyramids into the blue sky. At their feet lay a straggle of low buildings, a crisscross of walls, and on three sides the precipices fell sheer into the plain. A few columns of smoke mounted perpendicularly into the windless air and were lost. Queer, said Lenina, very queer. It was her ordinary word of condemnation. I don't like it, and I don't like that man. She pointed to the Indian guide, who had been evidently reciprocated. The very back of the man, as he walked along before them, was hostile, sullenly contemptuous. Besides, she lowered her voice, he smells. Bernard did not attempt to deny it. They walked on. Suddenly it was as though the whole air had come alive and were pulsing with the indefatigable movement of blood. Up there, in Malface, the drums were being beaten. Their feet fell in with the rhythm of that mysterious heart. They quickened their pace. Their path led them to the foot of the precipice. The sides of the great mesa ship towered over them, 300 feet to the gunwale. I wish we could have brought the plane, said Lenina, looking up resentfully at the blank impeding rock face. I hate walking, and you feel so small when you're on the ground at the bottom of a hill. They walked along for some way in the shadow of the mesa, rounded a projection, and there, in a water-worn ravine, was the way up the companion ladder. They climbed. It was a very steep path that zigzagged from side to side of the gully. Sometimes the pulsing of the drums was all but inaudible. At others, they seemed to be beating only just round the corner. When they were halfway up, an eagle flew past so close to them that the wind of his wings blew chill on their faces. In a crevice of the rock lay a pile of bones. It was all oppressingly queer, and the Indians smelled stronger and stronger. They emerged at last from the ravine into the full sunlight. The top of the mesa was a flat deck of stone, like the Charing Tea Tower, was Lenina's comment. But she was not allowed to enjoy her discovery of this reassuring resemblance for long. A padding of soft feet made them turn round. Naked from throat to navel, their dark brown bodies painted with white lines, like asphalt tennis courts, Lenina was later to explain, their faces inhuman with daubings of scarlet, black, and ochre, two Indians came running along the path. Their black hair was braided with fox fur and red flannel. Cloaks of turkey feathers fluttered from their shoulders. Huge feathered diadems exploded gaudily round their heads. With every step they took came the clink and rattle of their silver bracelets, their heavy necklaces of bone and turquoise beads. They came on without a word, running quietly in their deerskin moccasins. One of them was holding a feather brush, the other carried, in either hand, what looked at a distance like 3 or 4 pieces of thick rope. One of the ropes writhed uneasily, and suddenly Lenina saw that they were snakes. The men came nearer and nearer. Their dark eyes looked at her, but without giving any sign of recognition, any smallest sign that they had seen her or were aware of her existence. The writhing snake hung limp again with the rest. The men passed. I don't like it, said Lenina. I don't like it. She liked even less what awaited her at the entrance to the pueblo, where their guide had left them while he went inside for instructions. The dirt, to start with, the piles of rubbish, the dust, the dogs, the fleas. Her face wrinkled up into a grimace of disgust. She held her handkerchief to her nose. But how can they live like this? She broke out in a voice of indignant incredulity. It wasn't possible. Bernard shrugged his shoulders philosophically. Anyhow, he said, they've been doing it for the last 5 or 6,000 years, so I suppose they must be used to it by now. But cleanliness is next to fourthliness, she insisted. Yes, and civilization is sterilization, Bernard went on, concluding on a tone of irony the second hypnopedic lesson in elementary hygiene. But these people have never heard of our fort, and they aren't civilized, so there's no point in... Oh, she gripped his arm. Look! An almost naked Indian was very slowly climbing down the ladder from the first floor terrace of a neighboring house, rung after rung. With the tremulous caution of extreme old age, his face was profoundly wrinkled and black, like a mask of obsidian. The toothless mouth had fallen in. At the corners of the lips, and on each side of the chin, a few long bristles gleamed almost white against the dark skin. The long unbraided hair hung down in grey wisps round his face. His body was bent and emaciated to the bone, almost fleshless. Very slowly he came down, pausing at each rung before he ventured another step. What's the matter with him? Whispered Lenina. Her eyes were wide with horror and amazement. He's old, that's all, Bernard answered as carelessly as he could. He too was startled, but he made an effort to seem unmoved. Old? She repeated. But the director's old. Lots of people are old, but they're not like this. That's because we don't allow them to be like that. We preserve them from diseases. We keep their internal secretions artificially balanced at a youthful equilibrium. We don't permit their magnesium-calcium ratio to fall below what it was at 30. We give them transfusions of young blood. We keep their metabolism permanently stimulated. So of course they don't look like that. Partly, he added, because most of them die long before they reach this old creature's age. Youth almost unimpaired till 60, and then, crack! The end. But Lenina was not listening. She was watching the old man. Slowly he came down. His feet touched the ground. He turned. In their deep sunken orbits, his eyes were still extraordinarily bright. They looked at her for a long moment expressionlessly, without surprise, as though she had not been there at all. Then slowly, with bent back, the old man hobbled past them and was gone. But it's terrible, Lenina whispered. It's awful. We ought not to have come here. She felt in her pocket for some soma, only to discover that, by some unprecedented oversight, she had left the bottle down at the rest house. Bernard's pockets were also empty. Lenina was left to face the horrors of Malface unaided. They came crowding in on her thick and fast. The spectacle of two young women giving breast to their babies made her blush and turn away her face. She had never seen anything so indecent in her life. And what made it worse was that instead of tactfully ignoring it, Bernard proceeded to make open comments on this revoltingly viviparous scene. Ashamed, now that the effect of the soma had worn off, of the weakness he had displayed that morning in the hotel, he went out of his way to show himself strong and unorthodox. What a wonderfully intimate relationship, he said, deliberately outrageous. And what an intensity of feeling it must generate. I often think one may have missed something in not having had a mother. And perhaps you've missed something in not being a mother, Lenina. Imagine yourself sitting there with, with a little baby of your own. Bernard, how could you? The passage of an old woman with ophthalmia and a disease of the skin distracted her from her indignation. Let's go away, she begged. I don't like it. But at this moment their guide came back and, beckoning them to follow, led the way down the narrow streets between the houses. They rounded the corner. A dead dog was lying on a rubbish heap. A woman with a goiter was looking for lice in the hair of a small girl. Their guide halted at the foot of a ladder, raised his hand perpendicularly, then darted it horizontally forward. They did what he mutely commanded, climbed the ladder, and walked through the doorway, to which it gave access, into a long, narrow room, rather dark and smelling of smoke, and cooked grease, and long worn, long unwashed clothes. At the further end of the room was another doorway, through which came a shaft of sunlight and a noise, very loud and close, of the drums. They stepped across the threshold and found themselves on a wide terrace. Below them, shut in by the tall houses, was the village square, crowded with Indians, bright blankets and feathers in black hair, and the glint of turquoise and dark skins shining with heat. Lenina put her handkerchief to her nose again. In the open space at the center of the square were two circular platforms of masonry and trampled clay, the roofs, it was evident, of underground chambers, for in the center of each platform was an open hatchway, with a ladder emerging from the lower darkness. A sound of subterranean flute playing came up and was almost lost in the steady, remorseless persistence of the drums. Lenina liked the drums. Shutting her eyes, she abandoned herself to their soft, repeated thunder, allowing it to invade her consciousness more and more completely, till at last there was nothing left in the world but that one deep pulse of sound. It reminded her reassuringly of the synthetic noises made at solidarity services and Forge Day celebrations. Orgy porgy, she whispered to herself. These drums beat out just the same rhythm. There was a sudden startling burst of singing, hundreds of male voices crying out fiercely in harsh metallic unison. Few long notes and silence, the thunderous silence of the drums. Then shrill, in a neighing treble, the women answered. Then again the drums, and once more the men's deep savage affirmation of their manhood. Queer? Yes, the place was queer. So was the music. So were the clothes and the goiters and the skin diseases and the old people. But the performance itself, there seemed to be nothing specially queer about that. It reminds me of a lower caste community sing, she told Bernard. But a little later it was reminding her a good deal less of that innocuous function, for suddenly there had swarmed up from those round chambers underground a ghastly troop of monsters, hideously masked or painted out of all semblance of humanity. They had tramped out a strange limping dance round the square, round and again round, singing as they went, round and round, each time a little faster, and the drums had changed and quickened their rhythm, so that it became like the pulsing of fever in their ears. And the crowd had begun to sing with the dancers, louder and louder. And first one woman had shrieked, and then another, as though they were being killed. And then suddenly the leader of the dancers broke out of the line, ran to a big wooden chest which was standing at one end of the square, raised the lid and pulled out a pair of black snakes. A great yell went up from the crowd, and all the other dancers ran towards him with outstretched hands. He tossed the snakes to the first comers. then dipped back into the chest for more. More and more. Black snakes and brown and mottled. He flung them out, and then the dance began again on a different rhythm. Round and round they went with their snakes, snakily, with a soft, undulating movement at the knees and hips, round and round. Then the leader gave a signal, and one after another, all the snakes were flung down in the middle of the square. An old man came up from the underground and sprinkled them with cornmeal, and from the other hatchway came a woman and sprinkled them with water from a black jar. Then the old man lifted his hand, and startlingly, terrifyingly, there was almost silence. The drums stopped, beating. Life seemed to have come to an end. The old man pointed towards the two hatchways that gave entrance to the lower world, and slowly, raised by invisible hands from below, there emerged from the one a painted image of an eagle, from the other that of a man, naked and nailed to a cross. They hung there, seemingly self-sustained, as though watching. The old man clapped his hands. Naked, but for a white cotton breechcloth, a boy of about 18 stepped out of the crowd and stood before him. His hands crossed over his chest, his head bowed. The old man made the sign of the cross over him and turned away. Slowly, the boy began to walk round the writhing heap of snakes. He had completed the first circuit and was halfway through the second when, from among the dancers, a tall man wearing the mask of a coyote and holding in his hand a whip of plaited leather advanced towards him. The boy moved as though unaware of the other's existence. The coyote man raised his whip. There was a long moment of expectancy, then a swift movement, the whistle of the lash and its loud, flat-sounding impact on the flesh. The boy's body quivered, but he made no sound. He walked on at the same slow, steady pace. The coyote struck again, and at every blow at first a gasp, and then a deep groan went up from the crowd. The boy walked. Twice, thrice, 4 times round he went. The blood was streaming. 5 times round. 6 times round. Suddenly Lenina covered her face with her hands and began to sob. "Oh, stop them! Stop them!" she implored. But the whip fell, and fell inexorably. 7 times round. Then all at once the boy staggered, and still without a sound, pitched forward onto his face. Bending over him, the old man touched his back with a long white feather, held it up for a moment, crimson, for the people to see, then shook it thrice over the snakes. A few drops fell, and suddenly the drums broke out again into a panic of hurrying notes. There was a great shout. The dancers rushed forward, picked up the snakes, and ran out of the square. Men, women, children, all the crowd ran after them. A minute later the square was empty. Only the boy remained, prone where he had fallen, quite still. 3 old women came out of one of the houses, and with some difficulty lifted him and carried him in. The eagle and the man on the cross kept guard for a little while over the empty pueblo. Then, as though they had seen enough, sank slowly down through their hatchways, out of sight into the netherworld. Lenina was still sobbing. "Too awful," she kept repeating, and all Bernard's consolations were in vain. "Too awful! That blood!" she shuddered. "Oh, I wish I had my soma." There was the sound of feet in the inner room. Lenina did not move, but sat with her face in her hands, unseeing, apart. Only Bernard turned round. The dress of the young man who now stepped out onto the terrace was Indian, but his plaited hair was straw-colored, his eyes a pale blue, and his skin a white skin, bronzed. "Hullo, good morrow," said the stranger in faultless but peculiar English. "You're civilized, aren't you? You come from the other place, outside the reservation." "Who on earth?" Bernard began in astonishment. The young man sighed and shook his head. "A most unhappy gentleman, and pointing to the bloodstains in the center of the square. "Do you see that damned spot?" he asked in a voice that trembled with emotion. "A gram is better than a dam," said Lenina mechanically from behind her hands. "I wish I had my soma." "I ought to have been there," the young man went on. "Why wouldn't they let me be the sacrifice? I'd have gone round 10 times, 12, 15. Paloitiwa only got as far as 7. They could have had twice as much blood from me. The multitudinous seas incarnadine." He flung out his arms in a lavish gesture, then despairingly let them fall again. "But they wouldn't let me. They disliked me for my complexion. It's always been like that, always." Tears stood in the young man's eyes. He was ashamed and turned away. Astonishment made Lenina forget the deprivation of a soma. She uncovered her face and, for the first time, looked at the stranger. "Do you mean to say that you wanted to be hit with that whip?" Still averted from her, the young man made a sign of affirmation. "For the sake of the pueblo, to make the rains come and the corn grow, and to please Pukong and Jesus, and then to show that I can bear pain without crying out. Yes." And his voice suddenly took on a new resonance. He turned with a proud squaring of the shoulders, a proud, defiant lifting of the chin, "to show that I'm a man. Oh!" He gave a gasp and was silent, gaping. He had seen for the first time in his life the face of a girl whose cheeks were not the color of chocolate or dogskin, whose hair was auburn and permanently waved, and whose expression, amazing novelty, was one of benevolent interest. Lenina was smiling at him. Such a nice-looking boy, she was thinking, and a really beautiful body. The blood rushed up into the young man's face. He dropped his eyes, raised them again for a moment only to find her still smiling at him, and was so much overcome that he had to turn away and pretend to be looking very hard at something on the other side of the square. Bernard's questions made a diversion. Who, how, when, from where? Keeping his eyes fixed on Bernard's face, for so passionately did he long to see Lenina smiling that he simply dared not look at her, the young man tried to explain himself. Linda and he, Linda, was his mother. The word made Lenina look uncomfortable. Were strangers in the reservation. Linda had come from the other place long ago, before he was born, with a man who was his father. Bernard pricked up his ears. She had gone walking alone in those mountains over there to the north, had fallen down a steep place and hurt her head. Go on, said Bernard excitedly. Some hunters from Malface had found her and brought her to the pueblo. As for the man who was his father, Linda had never seen him again. His name was Tomakin. Yes, Thomas was the DHC's first name. He must have flown away, back to the other place, away without her, a bad, unkind, unnatural man. And so I was born in Malface, he concluded. In Malface. And he shook his head. The squalor of the little house on the outskirts of the pueblo. A space of dust and rubbish separated it from the village. 2 famine-stricken dogs were nosing obscenely in the garbage at its door. Inside, when they entered, twilight stank and was loud with flies. Linda, the young man called. From the inner room, a rather hoarse female voice said, "Coming!" They waited, in bowls on the floor were the remains of a meal, perhaps of several meals. The door opened, a very stout blonde squaw stepped across the threshold and stood looking at the strangers, staring incredulously, her mouth open. Lenina noticed with disgust that the 2 of the front teeth were missing, and the color of the ones that remained. She shuddered. It was worse than that old man. So fat, and all the lines in her face, the flabbiness, the wrinkles, and the sagging cheeks, with those purplish blotches, and the red veins on her nose, the bloodshot eyes, and that neck, and the blanket she wore over her head, ragged and filthy, and under the brown sack-shaped tunic those enormous breasts, the bulge of the stomach, the hips, all much worse than the old man, much worse. And suddenly the creature burst out in a torrent of speech, rushed at her with outstretched arms, and Ford, it was too revolting. In another moment she'd be sick. Pressed her against the bulge, the bosom, and began to kiss her. Ford, to kiss, slobberingly, and smelled too horrible. Obviously, never had a bath, and simply reeked of that beastly stuff that was put into Delta and Epsilon bottles. No, it wasn't true about Bernard. Positively stank of alcohol. She broke away as quickly as she could. A blubbered and distorted face confronted her. The creature was crying. "Oh, my dear, my dear!" The torrent of words flowed sobbingly. "If you knew how glad, after all these years, a civilized face, yes, and civilized clothes, because I thought I should never see a piece of real acetate silk again." She fingered the sleeve of Lenina's shirt. The nails were black. "And those adorable viscose velveteen shorts. Do you know, dear, I've still got my old clothes, the ones I came in, put away in a box. I'll show them to you afterwards, though, of course, the acetate has all gone into the holes. But such a lovely white bandolier, though I must say your green morocco is even lovelier, not that it did me much good, that bandolier." Her tears began to flow again. "I suppose John told you what I had to suffer, and not a gram of soma to be had, only a drink of mescal every now and then, when Popeye used to bring it. Popeye is a boy I used to know, but it makes you feel so bad afterwards. The mescal does, and you're sick with the piodel. Beside, it always made that awful feeling of being ashamed much worse the next day, and it was so ashamed. Just think of it, me, a beta, having a baby. Put yourself in my place." The mere suggestion made Lenina shudder. "Though it wasn't my fault, I swear, because I still don't know how it happened. Seeing that I did all the Malthusian drill, you know, by numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, always. I swear, but all the same it happened. And of course there wasn't anything like an abortion center here. It's still down in Chelsea, by the way. Is it still down in Chelsea, by the way?" She asked. Lenina nodded. "And still floodlighted on Tuesdays and Fridays?" Lenina nodded again. "That lovely pink glass tower." Poor Linda lifted her face, and with closed eyes ecstatically contemplated the bright remembered image. "And the river at night," she whispered. Great tears oozed slowly out from behind her tight-shut eyelids. "And flying back in the evening from Stoke Poach, and then a hot bath and a vibrofracuum massage. But there!" She drew a deep breath, shook her head, opened her eyes again, sniffled once or twice, then blew her nose on her fingers and wiped them on the skirt of her tunic. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said in response to Lenina's involuntary grimace of disgust. "I oughtn't to have done that. I'm sorry, but what are you to do when there aren't any handkerchiefs? I remember how it used to upset me, and all that dirt, and nothing being aseptic. I had an awful cut on my head when they first brought me here. You can't imagine what they used to put on it. Filth. Just filth. Civilization is sterilization, I used to say to them, and streptocock ghee to Banbury tea, to see a fine bathroom and WC, as though they were children. But of course they didn't understand. How should they? And in the end I suppose I got used to it. And anyhow, how can you keep things clean when there isn't any hot water laid on? And look at these clothes. This beastly wool isn't like acetate. It lasts and lasts. And you're supposed to mend it if it gets torn, but I'm a beta. I worked in the fertilizing room. Nobody ever taught me to do anything like that. It wasn't my business. Besides, it never used to be right to mend clothes. Throw them away when they got holes in them and buy new. The more stitches, the less riches. Isn't that right? Mending antisocial. But it's all different here. It's like living with lunatics. Everything they do is mad. She looked round, saw John and Bernard had left them and were walking up and down in the dust and garbage outside the house, but nonetheless confidentially lowering her voice and leaning, while Lenina stiffened and shrank, so close that the blown reek of embryo poison stirred the hair on her cheek. For instance, she hoarsely whispered, take the way they have one another here. Mad, I tell you, absolutely mad. Everybody belongs to everybody else, don't they? Don't they? She insisted, tugging at Lenina's sleeve. Lenina nodded her averted head, let out the breath she had been holding and managed to draw another, relatively untainted. Well, here, the other went on, nobody's supposed to belong to more than one person, and then if you have people in the ordinary way, the others think that you're wicked and antisocial. They hate and despise you. Once a lot of women came and made a scene because their men came to see me. Well, why not? And then they rushed at me. No, it was too awful. I can't tell you about it. Linda covered her face with her hands and shuddered. They're so hateful, the women here. Mad and cruel. And of course they don't know anything about Malthusian drill, or bottles, or decanting, or anything of that sort. So they're having children all the time, like dogs. It's too revolting. And to think that oh, Ford, and yet John was a great comfort. To me, I don't know what I should have done without him, even though he did get so upset whenever a man, quite as a tiny boy even once, but it was when he was bigger, he tried to kill poor Wayahushua. Or was it Pope? Just because I used to have them sometimes. Because I never could make him understand that was what civilized people ought to do. Being mad's infectious, I believe. Anyhow, John seems to have caught it from the Indians, because, of course, he was with them a lot, even though they always were so beastly to him, and wouldn't let him do all the things the other boys did, which was a good thing in a way, because it made it easier for me to condition him a little, though you've no idea how difficult that is. There's so much one doesn't know. It wasn't my business to know. I mean, when a child asks you how a helicopter works, or who made the world, well, what are you to answer if you're a beta, and you've always worked in the fertilizing room? What are you to answer? Chapter 8. Outside in the dust and among the garbage, there were 4 dogs now. Bernard and John were walking slowly up and down. So hard for me to realize, Bernard was saying, to reconstruct, as though we were living on different planets, in different centuries, a mother, and all this dirt, and gods, and old age, and disease. He shook his head. It's almost inconceivable. I shall never understand, unless you explain. Explain what? This, he indicated the pueblo, that. And it was the little house outside the village. Everything, all your life. But what is there to say? From the beginning, as far back as you can remember. As far back as I can remember, John frowned. There was a long silence. It was very hot, and they'd eaten a lot of tortillas and sweet corn, Linda said. Linda said, "Come and lie down, baby." They lay down together in the big bed. "Sing," and Linda sang. Sang Streptocock G to Banbury Tea, and Bye Baby Banting, soon you'll be decanting. Her voice got fainter and fainter. There was a loud noise, and he woke with a start. A man was saying something to Linda, and Linda was laughing. She had pulled the blanket up to her chin, but the man pulled it down again. His hair was like 2 black ropes, and round his arm was a lovely silver bracelet with blue stones in it. He liked the bracelet, but all the same he was frightened. He hid his face against Linda's body. Linda put her hand on him, and he felt safer. In those other words he did not understand so well, she said to the man, "Not with John here." The man looked at him, then again at Linda, and said a few words in a soft voice. Linda said, "No," but the man bent over the bed towards him, and his face was huge, terrible. The black ropes of hair touched the blanket. "No," Linda said again, and he felt her hand squeezing him more tightly. "No, no!" But the man took hold of one of his arms, and it hurt. He screamed. The man put up his other hand and lifted him up. Linda was still holding him, still saying, "No, no," but the man said something short and angry, and suddenly her hands were gone. "Linda! Linda!" He kicked and wriggled, but the man carried him across to the door, opened it, put him down on the floor in the middle of the other room, and went away. Shutting the door behind him, he got up, he ran to the door. Standing on tiptoe, he could just reach the big wooden latch. He lifted it and pushed, but the door wouldn't open. "Linda!" he shouted. She didn't answer. He remembered a huge room, rather dark, and there were big wooden things with strings fastened to them, and lots of women standing round them, making blankets. Linda told him to sit in the corner with the other children, while she went and helped the women. He played with the little boys for a long time. Suddenly people started talking very loud, and there were the women pushing Linda away, and Linda was crying. She went to the door, and he ran after her. He asked her why they were angry. "Because I broke something," she said, and then she got angry too. "How should I know how to do that beastly weaving?" she said. "Beastly savages." He asked her what savages were. When they got back to their house, Popeye was waiting at the door, and he came in with them. He had a big gourd full of stuff that looked like water, only it wasn't water, but something with a bad smell that burned your mouth and made you cough. Linda drank some, and Popeye drank some. Then Linda laughed a lot and talked very loud, and then she and Popeye went into the other room. When Popeye went away, he went into the room. Linda was in bed, so fast asleep that he couldn't wake her. Popeye used to come often. He said the stuff in the gourd was called mescal, but Linda said it ought to be called soma, only it made you feel ill afterwards. He hated Popeye. He hated them all the men who came to see Linda. One afternoon, when he had been playing with the other children, it was cold, he remembered, and there was snow on the mountains. He came back to the house and heard angry voices in the bedroom. They were women's voices, and they said words he didn't understand, but I knew they were dreadful words. Then suddenly, crash! Something was upset. He heard people moving about quickly, and there was another crash, and then a noise like hitting a mule, only not so bony. Then Linda screamed, "Oh, don't! Don't! Don't!" she said. He ran in. There were 3 women in dark blankets. Linda was on the bed. One of the women was holding her wrists. Another was lying across her legs, so that she couldn't kick. The third was hitting her with a whip. Once, twice, 3 times, and each time Linda screamed. Crying, he tugged at the fringe of the woman's blanket. "Please, please!" With her free hands she held him away. The whip came down again, and again Linda screamed. He caught hold of the woman's enormous brown hand between his own and bit it with all his might. She cried out, wrenched her hand free, and gave him such a push that he fell down. While he was lying on the ground, she hit him 3 times with the whip. It hurt more than anything he had ever felt. Like fire. The whip whistled again, fell, but this time it was Linda who screamed. "But why did they want to hurt you, Linda?" he asked at night. He was crying, because the red marks of the whip on his back still hurt so terribly. But he was also crying because people were so beastly and unfair, because he was only a little boy and couldn't do anything against them. Linda was crying too. She was grown up, but she wasn't big enough to fight against three of 'em. It wasn't fair for her either. Why did they want to hurt you, Linda? I don't know. How should I know? It was difficult to hear what she said, because she was lying on the stomach and her face was in the pillow. They say those men are their men, she went on, and she didn't seem to be talking to him at all. She seemed to be talking with someone inside herself. A long talk which she didn't understand. And, in the end, she started crying louder than ever. Oh, don't cry, Linda. Don't cry. He pressed himself against her. He put his hands round her neck. Linda cried out, Oh, be careful! My shoulder! Oh! And she pushed him away, hard. His head banged against the wall. Little idiot! She shouted, and then suddenly she began to slap him. Slap! Slap! Linda, he cried out. Oh, mother, don't! I'm not your mother. I won't be your mother. But Linda, oh! She slapped him on the cheek. Turn into a savage, she shouted, having young ones like an animal. If it hadn't been for you, I might have gone to the inspector. I might have got away. But not with a baby. That would have been too shameful. He saw that she was going to hit him again, and lifted his arms to guard his face. Oh, don't, Linda. Please don't. Little beast. She pulled down his arm. His face was uncovered. Don't, Linda. He shut his eyes, expecting the blow, but she didn't hit him. After a little time, he opened his eyes again and saw that she was looking at him. He tried to smile at her. Suddenly, she put her arms round him and kissed him again and again. Sometimes, for several days, Linda didn't get up at all. She lay in bed and was sad, or else she drank the stuff that Poppy bought and laughed a great deal and went to sleep. Sometimes she was sick. Often she forgot to wash him, and there was nothing to eat except cold tortillas. He remembered the first time she found those little animals in his hair, how she screamed and screamed. The happiest times were when she told him about the other place. And you really can go flying, whenever you like. Whenever you like. And still she would tell him about the lovely music that came out of a box, and all the nice games you could play, and the delicious things to eat and drink, and the light that came when you pressed the little thing in the wall, and the pictures that you could hear and feel and smell, as well as see, and another box for making nice smells, and the pink and green and blue and silver houses as high as mountains, and everybody happy, and no one ever sad or angry, and everyone belonging to everyone else, and the boxes where you could see and hear what was happening at the other side of the world, and babies in lovely clean bottles, everything so clean, and no nasty smells, no dirt at all, and people never lonely, but living together and being so jolly and happy, like the summer dances here in Malface, but much happier, and the happiness being there every day. Every day. He listened by the hour, and sometimes when he and the other children were tired with too much playing, one of the old men of the pueblo would talk to them, in those other words, of the great transformer of the world, and of the long fight between right hand and left hand, between wet and dry, of Awawilona, who had a great fog by thinking in the night, who made a great fog by thinking in the night, and then made the whole world out of the fog, of Earth Mother and Sky Father, of Ayayuta and Marsailema, the twins of War and Chance, of Jesus and Pulkong, of Mary and Estanateli, the woman who makes herself young again, of the black stone at Laguna, and the great eagle, and Our Lady of Acoma. Strange stories, all the more wonderful to him for being told in the other words and not so fully understood. Lying in bed, he would think of heaven, and London, and Our Lady of Acoma, and the rows and rows of babies in clean bottles, and Jesus flying up, and Linda flying up, and the great director of World Hatcheries and Awona Wilona. Lots of men came to see Linda. The boys began to point their fingers at him. In the strange other words, they said that Linda was bad. They called her names he did not understand, but that he knew were bad names. One day they sang a song about her, again and again. He threw stones at them. They threw back. A sharp stone cut his cheek. The blood wouldn't stop. He was covered in blood. Linda taught him to read. With a piece of charcoal she drew images on the wall. An animal sitting down, a baby inside a bottle. Then she wrote letters. The cat is on the mat. The tot is in the pot. He learned quickly and easily. When he knew how to read all the words she wrote on the wall, Linda opened her big wooden box and pulled out from under those funny little red trousers she never wore, a thin little book he had often seen before. When you're bigger, she had said, you can read it. Well, now he was big enough. He was proud. I'm afraid you won't find it very interesting, she said, but it's the only thing I have. She sighed. If only you could see the lovely reading machines we used to have in London. He began reading. The chemical and bacteriological conditioning of the embryo. Practical instructions for beta embryo store workers. It took him a quarter of an hour to read the title alone. He threw the book on the floor. Beastly book, he said, and began to cry. The boys still sang their horrible song about Linda. Sometimes, too, they laughed at him for being so ragged. When he wore his clothes, Linda did not know how to mend them. In the other place, she told him, people threw away clothes with holes in them and got new ones. Rags, rags, the boys used to shout at him. But I can read, he said to himself, and they can't. They don't even know what reading is. It was fairly easy, if he thought hard enough about reading, to pretend that he didn't mind when they made fun of him. He asked Linda to give him the book again. The more the boys pointed and sang, the harder he read. Soon he could read all the words quite well, even the longest. But what did they mean? He asked Linda, but even when she could answer, it didn't seem to make it very clear, and generally she couldn't answer at all. What are chemicals? He would ask. Oh, stuff like magnesium salts and alcohol for keeping the deltas and epsilons small and backward, and calcium carbonate for bones, and all that sort of thing. But how do you make chemicals, Linda? And where do they come from? Well, I don't know. You get them out of bottles, and when the bottles are empty, you send up to the chemical store for more. It's the chemical store people who make them, I suppose, or else they send to the factory for them. I don't know. I never did any chemistry. My job was always with the embryos. It was the same with everything else he asked about. Linda never seemed to know. The old man of the pueblo had much more definite answers. The seed of men and all creatures, the seed of the sun, and the seed of the earth, and the seed of the sky. Agua Wilona made them all out of the fog of increase. Now the world has 4 wombs, and he laid the seeds in the lowest of the 4 wombs, and gradually the seeds began to grow. One day, John calculated later that it must have been soon after his 12th birthday, he came home and found a book he had never seen before, lying on the floor in the bedroom. It was a thick book and looked very old. The binding had been eaten by mice. Some of its pages were loose and crumpled. He picked it up, looked at the title page. The book was called The Complete Works of William Shakespeare. Linda was lying on the bed, sipping that horrible stinking mescal out of a cup. Pope brought it, she said. Her voice was thick and hoarse like somebody else's voice. It was lying in one of the chests of the Antelope Kiva. It's supposed to have been there for hundreds of years. I expect it's true, because I looked at it, and it seemed to be full of nonsense. Uncivilized. Still, it will be good enough for you to practice your reading on." She took a last sip, set the cup down on the floor beside the bed, turned over on her side, hiccuped once or twice, and then went to sleep. He opened a book at random. "Nay, but to live in the rank sweat of an enseamed bed, stewed in corruption, honeying and making love over the nasty sty." The strange words rolled through his mind, rumbled like talking thunder, like the drums at the summer dances, if the drums could have spoken, like the men singing the corn song. Beautiful, beautiful, so that you cried, like old Mitsima saying magic over his feathers and his carved sticks and his bits of bone and stone. Kiatlat silu siloque siloque siloque. Kiaya silu silu sifel. But better than Mitsima's magic, because it meant more, because it talked to him, talked wonderfully, and only half understandably. A terrible, beautiful magic, about Linda lying there snoring, with the empty cup on the floor beside the bed. About Linda and Pope. Linda and Pope. He hated Pope more and more. A man can smile and be a villain. Remorseless, treacherous, lecherous, kindless villain. What did the words exactly mean? He only half knew. But their magic was strong and went on rumbling in his head. And somehow it was as though he had never really hated Pope before. Never really hated him because he had never been able to say how much he hated him. But now he had these words like drums and singing and magic. These words and the strange story out of which they were taken. He couldn't make heads or tails of it, but it was wonderful, wonderful all the same. They gave him a reason for hating Pope, and they made his hatred more real. They even made Pope himself more real. One day, when he came in from playing, the door of the inner room was open, and he saw them lying together on the bed, asleep, white Linda and Pope almost black beside her, with one arm under her shoulders and the other dark hand on her breast, and one of the plaits of his long hair lying across her throat, like a black snake trying to strangle her. Pope's gourd and a cup were standing on the floor near the bed. Linda was snoring. His heart seemed to have disappeared and left the hole. He was empty and cold, and rather sick and giddy. He leaned against the wall to steady himself, remorseless, treacherous, lecherous, like drums, like the man singing for the corn, like magic. The words repeated and repeated themselves in his head. From being cold he was suddenly hot. His cheeks burned with the rush of blood. The room swam and darkened before his eyes. He ground his teeth. "I'll kill him. I'll kill him. I'll kill him," he kept saying, and suddenly there were more words. "When he is drunk asleep or in his rage, or in the incestuous pleasures of his bed." The magic was on his side. The magic explained and gave orders. He stepped back in the outer room. "When he is drunk asleep." The knife for the meat was lying on the floor near the fireplace. He picked it up and tiptoed to the room again. "When he is drunk asleep, drunk asleep." He ran across the room and stabbed. Oh, the blood! Stabbed again, as Poppe heaved out of his sleep, lifted his hand to stab once more, but he found his wrist caught and held. Oh, oh! He twisted, he couldn't move. He was trapped, and there were Poppe's small black eyes, very close, staring into his own. He looked away. There were 2 cuts on Poppe's left shoulder. "Oh, look at the blood," Linda was crying. "Look at the blood!" She had never been able to bear the sight of blood. Pope lifted his other hand, to strike him, he thought. He stiffened to receive the blow, but the hand only took him under the chin and turned his face, so that he had to look again into Pope's eyes, for a long time, for hours and hours, and suddenly he couldn't help it. He began to cry. Poppy burst out laughing. Go, he said, in the other Indian words. Go, my brave Ahayuta. He ran out into the other room to hide his tears. You are 15, said old Mitsima in the Indian words. Now I may teach you to work the clay. Squatting by the river they worked together. First of all, said Mitsima, taking a lump of the wetted clay between his hands, we make a little moon. The old man squeezed the lump into a disk, then bent up the edges. The moon became a shallow cup. Slowly and skillfully he imitated the old man's delicate gestures. A moon, a cup, and now a snake. Mitsima rolled out another piece of clay into a long, flexible cylinder, hooped it into a circle, and pressed it on the rim of the cup. Then another snake, and another, and another. Round by round, Mitsima built up the sides of the pot. It was narrow, it bulged, it narrowed again towards the neck. Mitsima squeezed and patted, stroked and scraped, and there at last it stood, in shape the familiar water pot of Malphase, but creamy white instead of black, and still soft to the touch. The crooked parody of Mitsima's, his own stood beside him. Looking at the two pots, he had to laugh. But the next one will be better, he said, and began to moisten another piece of clay. To fashion, to give form, to feel his fingers gaining in skill and power. This gave him an extraordinary pleasure. A, B, C, vitamin D, he sang to himself as he worked. The fat's in the liver, the cod's in the sea. And Mitsima also sang, a song about killing a bear. They worked all day and all day. He was filled with an intense, absorbing happiness. Next winter, said old Mitsima, I will teach you to make the bow. He stood for a long time outside the house, and at last the ceremonies within were finished. The door opened. They came out. Kotlu came first, his right hand outstretched and tightly closed, as though over some precious jewel. Her clenched hand similarly outstretched, Kiakime followed. They walked in silence, and in silence behind them came the brothers and sisters and cousins and all the troop of old people. They walked out of the pueblo, across the mesa. At the edge of the cliff they halted, facing the early morning sun. Kotlu opened his hand. A pinch of cornmeal lay white on the palm. He breathed on it, murmured a few words, then threw it, a handful of white dust towards the sun. Kiakime did the same. Then Kiakime's father stepped forward, and, holding up a feathered prayer stick, made a long prayer, then threw the stick after the cornmeal. It is finished, said old Mitsima in a loud voice. They are married. Well, said Linda as they turned away, all I can say is, it does seem a lot of fuss to make about so little. In civilized countries, when a boy wants to have a girl, he just... But where are you going, John? He paid no attention to her calling, but ran on. Away. Away anywhere to be by himself. It is finished, old Mitsima's words repeated themselves in his mind. Finished. Finished. In silence and from a long way off. But violently, desperately, hopelessly, he had loved Kiakime, and now it was finished. He was 16. At the full moon, in the antelope kiva, secrets would be told, secrets would be done and born. They would go down, boys, into the kiva and come out again, men. The boys were all afraid and at the same time impatient. At last it was the day. The sun went down, the moon rose. He went with the others. Men were standing, dark at the entrance to the kiva. The ladder went down into the red lighted depths. Already the leading boys had begun to climb down. Suddenly one of the men stepped forward, caught him by the arm, and pulled him out of the ranks. He broke free and dodged back into his place among the others. This time the man struck him, pulled his hair. "Not for you, white hair! Not for the son of the she-dog!" said one of the other men. The boys laughed. "Go!" And as he still hovered on the fringes of the group, "Go!" the men shouted again. One of them bent down, took a stone, threw it. "Go! Go! Go!" There was a shower of stones. Bleeding, he ran away into the darkness. From the red-lit kiva came the noise of singing. The last of the boys had climbed down the ladder. He was all alone. All alone, outside the pueblo, on the bare plain of the mesa. The rock was like bleached bones in the moonlight. Down in the valley the coyotes were howling at the moon. The bruises hurt him. The cuts were still bleeding. But it was not for pain that he sobbed. It was because he was all alone. Because he had been driven out, alone, into this skeleton world of rocks and moonlight. At the edge of the precipice he sat down. The moon was behind him. He looked down into the black shadow of the mesa, into the black shadow of death. He had only to take one step, one little jump. He held out his right hand in the moonlight. From the cut on his wrist, the blood was still oozing. Every few seconds a drop fell. Dark, almost colorless in the dead light. Drop, drop, drop. Tomorrow and tomorrow. And tomorrow. He had discovered time and death and God. Alone, always alone, the young man was saying. The words awoke a plaintive echo in Bernard's mind. Alone, alone. "So am I," he said, on a gush of confidingness. "Terribly alone." "Are you?" John looked surprised. "I thought it in the other place. I mean, Linda always said that nobody was ever alone there." Bernard blushed uncomfortably. "You see," he said, and mumbled, and with averted eyes, "I'm rather different from most people, I suppose. If one happens to be decanted different." "Yes, that's just it," the young man nodded. "If one's different, one's bound to be lonely." "They're beastly to one. Do you know, they shut me out of absolutely everything. When the other boys were sent on out to spend the night on the mountains, you know, when you have to dream with which your sacred animal is, they wouldn't let me go with the others. They wouldn't tell me any of the secrets. I did it by myself, though," he added. "Didn't eat anything for 5 days, and then went out one night, alone in those mountains there," he pointed. Patronizingly, Bernard smiled. "And did you dream anything?" he asked. The other nodded. "But I mustn't tell you what." He was silent for a little, then in a low voice, "Once," he went on, "I did something that none of the others did. I stood against a rock in the middle of the day, in summer, with my arms out, like Jesus on the cross. What on earth for? I wanted to know what it was like being crucified, hanging there in the sun. But why? Why? Well," he hesitated, "because I felt I ought to. If Jesus could stand it, and then, if one has done something wrong. Besides, I was unhappy. That was not a reason." "It seems a funny way of curing your unhappiness," said Bernard, but on second thoughts, he decided that there was, after all, some sense in it. Better than taking soma. "I fainted after a time," said the young man. "Fell down on my face. Do you see the mark where I cut myself?" He lifted the thick yellow hair from his forehead. The scar showed, pale and puckered, on his right temple. Bernard looked, then quickly, with a little shudder, averted his eyes. His conditioning had made him not so much pitiful as profoundly squeamish. The mere suggestion of illness or wounds was to him not only horrifying, but even repulsive and rather disgusting, like dirt or deformity or old age. Hastily he changed the subject. I wonder if you'd like to come back to London with us, he asked, making the first move in a campaign whose strategy he had been secretly elaborating ever since. In the little house, he had realized who the father of this young savage must be. Would you like that? The young man's face lit up. Do you really mean it? Of course, if I can get permission, that is. Linda, too? Well, he hesitated doubtfully. That revolting creature. No! It was impossible, unless it suddenly occurred to Bernard that her very revoltingness might prove an enormous asset. But of course, he cried, making up for his first hesitation with an excess of noisy cordiality. The young man drew a deep breath. To think it should be coming true. What I've dreamed of all my life. Do you remember what Miranda says? Who's Miranda? But the young man had evidently not heard the question. Oh, wonder, he was saying, and his eyes shone. His face was brightly flushed. How many goodly creatures are there here? How beauteous mankind is! The flush suddenly deepened. He was thinking of Lenina, of an angel in bottle green viscose, lustrous with youth and skin food. Plump, benevolently smiling, his voice faltered. Oh, brave new world, he began, then suddenly interrupted himself. The blood had left his cheeks. He was as pale as paper. Are you married to her? He asked. Am I what? Married, forever. They say forever in the Indian words. It can be broken. Thought no. Bernard couldn't help laughing. John also laughed, but for another reason. Laughed for pure joy. Oh, brave new world, he repeated. Oh, brave new world, that has such people in it. Let's start at once. You have a most peculiar way of talking sometimes, said Bernard, staring at the young man in perplexed astonishment. And, anyhow, hadn't you better wait till you actually see the new world? That was chapter 8. We'll be going into chapter 9 now. I'm gonna take a quick drinking break. I'll be right back. Yeah, well, I do really like reading. It kills my voice every time, so I can read like 3 chapters, and that's about my max, and then it just completely dies. Also, my mind tends to go kind of blank after a while with reading. I don't know if anyone else ever experienced such a thing. It's not a bad thing though. It's just this. It's like a fog appearing, but it kind of sucks you into the book as well, so it helps, I guess. Gonna take one more sip and then we get into chapter 9. Really sorry if I want to continue a story though, but then again, it's not like I really have any viewers to worry about pleasing, I guess. So, chapter 9. Lenina felt herself entitled, after this day of queerness and horror, to a complete and absolute holiday. As soon as they got back to the rest house, she swallowed 6 half-gram tablets of soma, lay down on her bed, and within 10 minutes had embarked for lunar eternity. It would be 18 hours at least before she was in time again. Bernard, meanwhile, lay pensive and wide-eyed in the dark. It was long after midnight before he fell asleep. Long after midnight. But his insomnia had not been fruitless. He had a plan. Punctually, on the following morning, at 10 o'clock, The green uniformed octoroon stepped out of his helicopter. Bernard was waiting for him among the agaves. Miss Crown's gone on Soma holiday, he explained. Can hardly be back before 5, which leaves us 7 hours. He could fly to Santa Fe, do all the business he had to do, and be in Malphase again long before she woke up. She'll be quite safe here by herself. Safe as helicopters, the octoroon assured him. They climbed into the machine and started off at once. At 10:34, they landed on the roof of the Santa Fe post office. At 10:37, Bernard had got through to the World Controller's office in Whitehall. At 10:39, he was speaking to his Fordship's fourth personal secretary. At 10:44, he was repeating his story to the first secretary, and at 10:47 and a half, it was the deep, resonant voice of Mustafa Mann himself that sounded in his ears. I venture to think, stammered Bernard, that your Fordship might find the matter of sufficient scientific interest. Yes, I do find it of sufficient scientific interest, said the deep voice. Bring these two individuals back to London with you. Your Fordship is aware that I shall need a special permit. The necessary orders, said Mustafa Mont, are being sent to the warden of the reservation at this moment. You will proceed at once to the warden's office. Good morning, Mr. Marks. There was a silence. Bernard hung up the receiver and hurried up to the roof. Warden's office, he said to the gamma-green octoroon. At 10:54, Bernard was shaking hands with the warden. Delighted, Mr. Marks, delighted. His boom was deferential. We have just received special orders. I know, said Bernard, interrupting him. I was talking to his Fordship on the phone a moment ago. His bored tone implied that he was in the habit of talking to his Fordship every day of the week. He dropped into a chair. If you'll kindly take all the necessary steps as soon as possible, he emphatically repeated. He was thoroughly enjoying himself. At 11:03, he had all the necessary papers in his pocket. So long, he said patronizingly to the warden, who had accompanied him as far as the lift gates. So long. He walked across to the hotel, had a bath, a vibrovac massage, and an electrolytic shave. Listened into the morning news, looked in for half an hour on the televisor, ate a leisure luncheon, and at 2:30 flew back with the octoroon to Malphase. The young man stood outside the rest house. Bernard, he called. Bernard! There was no answer. Noiseless on his deerskin moccasins, he ran up the steps and tried the door. The door was locked. They were gone. Gone! It was the most terrible thing that had ever happened to him. She had asked him to come and see them. And now they were gone. He sat down on the steps and cried. Half an hour later it occurred to him to look through the window. The first thing he saw was a green suitcase with the initials LC painted on the lid. Joy flared up like fire within him. He picked up a stone. The smashed glass tinkled on the floor. A moment later he was inside the room. He opened the green suitcase, and all at once he was breathing Lenina's perfume, filling his lungs with her essential being. His heart beat wildly. For a moment he was almost faint. Then, bending over the precious box, he lifted into the light, he examined. The zippers on Lenina's spare pair of viscose velveteen shorts were at first a puzzle, then solved. A delight. Zip, and then zip. Zip, and then zip. He was enchanted. Her green slippers were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He unfolded a pair of zippy kamikniks, blushed, put them hastily away again, but kissed the perfumed acetate handkerchief and wound the scarf round his neck. Opening a box, he spilled a cloud of scented powder. His hands were floury with the stuff. He wiped them on his chest, on his shoulders, and his bare arms. Delicious perfume. He shut his eyes. He rubbed his cheek against his own powdered arm. Touch of smooth skin against his face. Scent in his nostrils of musky dust. A real presence. Lenina, he whispered. Lenina! A noise made him start, made him guiltily turn. He crammed up his feveries into the suitcase and shut the lid, then listened again. Looked. Not a sign of life. Not a sound. And yet he had certainly heard something. Something like a sigh. Something like the creak of a board. He tiptoed to the door and, cautiously opening it, found himself looking onto a broad landing. On the opposite side of the landing was another door, ajar. He stepped out, pushed, peeped. There on a low bed, the sheet flung back, dressed in a pair of pink one-piece pajamas, lay Lenina, fast asleep and so beautiful in the midst of her curls, so touchingly childish, with her pink toes and her grave sleeping face, so trustful in the helplessness of her limp hands and melted limbs, and the tears came to his eyes, with an infinity of quite unnecessary precautions, for nothing short of a pistol shot could have called Lenina back from her Soma holiday before the appointed time. He entered the room. He knelt on the floor beside the bed. He gazed, he clasped his hands, his lips moved. Her eyes, he murmured. Her eyes, her hair, her cheek, her gait, her voice. Handless in thy discourse, oh, that her hands, in whose comparison all whites are ink, writing their own reproach, to whose soft seizure the sickness down is harsh. A fly buzzed round her. He waved it away. Flies, he remembered. On the wide wonder of dear Juliet's hand may seize and steal immortal blessings from her lips, who even in pure and vestal modesty still blush as thinking their own kisses sin. Very slowly, with the hesitating gesture of one who reaches forth to stroke a shy and possibly rather dangerous bird, he put out his hand. It hung there trembling, within an inch of those limp fingers, on the verge of contact. Did he dare to profane with his unworthiest hand that? No, he didn't. The bird was too dangerous. His hand dropped back. How beautiful she was! How beautiful! Then suddenly he found himself reflecting that he had only taken to take hold of the zipper at her neck and give one long, strong pull. He shut his eyes. He shook his head with the gesture of a dog shaking his ears as it emerges from the water. Detestable thought! He was ashamed of himself. Pure and vestal modesty. There was a humming in the air. Another fly, trying to steal immortal blessings. A wasp. He looked, saw nothing. The humming grew louder and louder, localized itself, being outside the shuttered window. The plane! In a panic, he scrambled to his feet and ran into the other room, vaulted through the open window, and hurrying along the path between the tall gaffs, was in time to receive burnt marks as he climbed out of the helicopter. That was chapter 9, and we will be continuing this another time. I don't know when I will be streaming next. Might be Tuesday, might be Wednesday. If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe, even though I don't really care about that stuff. If you made it to the end, again, I thank you for listening all the way through. I hope you at least got some sort of enjoyment out of it. I really like the book. It's not really what I expected, because it's been compared to like 1984. And 1984 has a lot more social political commentary, I think. Whereas this just frames a utopian world and the reaction of people to it. And I don't really see any strong opinions being formed here, but maybe I'm just retarded or something, even though that's a bad YouTube word, I guess. Um, so yeah, if you like this, please, yeah, I just hope to see you guys again next time, whenever that might be. I hope you have a nice Sunday or whatever day you're listening to this on. And I will see you guys next time.